So beyond that, there is some of the material that I would still like to cover that I think would be interesting to discuss. We talked a little bit about this ahead of time. I let you know about this guy, fairly popular in national public media. His name is Dave Portnoy, and he runs a company called Barstool Sports. And I thought this was interesting, especially had we had John Avery as a guest, talking a lot about what it takes to build a company, and, not just a company that's moving around ones and zeros, basically, not providing any value other than just moving money. And not to say there's like no value in, just moving money, but that's what a lot of companies, not just around Atlanta, but, really, within the whole like sort of tech space, it seems like there's a lot of value being created in the dollar sense, but not in the actual people getting value out of it, outside of them being an investor in the organization. So basically, like all of these, companies get, inflated valuations, having provided next to no real value to a customer base, right? Again, provided value maybe to investors, like the early investors that put in their money early, almost like a Ponzi scheme, right? And I'm not trying to promote that by any stretch of the imagination, but that seems like it's more often than not what people think about when they're like, oh, I'm going to go build a startup tech company and, build it to sell it off in, 3 to 5 years, 7 to 10 years, 5 to 7 years, whatever that time frame may be, as opposed to what's a company I can go build that's going to build, and deliver this set of products, services, or, software, maybe a combination of the two. That's going to be around for the long haul and provide real value at scale to people, right? And obviously, investors are in the game of making as much money as they can in as little of a time frame as possible. So it seems really, to me, over the last couple of decades, where there's really never been this sort of investor sort of environment in Atlanta, as we've talked about with like Dennis and Sig. But nationally speaking, it's almost like all the investors in technology don't actually want to fund the seed stage technology companies that are actually building real technology, because that could be a 10, 20 year payoff, when they're in the business of trying to get a payoff in really 3 to 5 years locally, 5 to 7 years more common out west, and even sometimes 7 to 10 years. But, for a company like us, we are talking, we're 8 years in now, given the first 2 years of that were me working part-time, and the next 6 years, again, not all of it is us doing the drone development, the software development. It's us just getting our feet wet, just trying to, understand the drone business, becoming drone operators, assisting drone operators, and then using that to figure out how we can make our own drones and our own drone software, given we had ideas, on how to do so ahead of time. But it's also not something that makes sense for, me to just go in full time into drone development, drone software development, if no one's leading the business development charge, right? So a lot of that time was also finding the right people that could help us on the hardware and software development sides without having to totally give up what's paying the bills, right? And allowing us to get to this point and making our own drone hardware and software. So a lot of that's to say that on the way over here, Dave Portnoy was talking about a very similar story from his perspective, where Barstool Sports, again, about a $500 million business now, for 6 years was in it full time. And then in year 6, he had to go work full time as he was just getting engaged, starting to have like a family outside of, getting Barstool off the ground. And then he was like 8 months in, realized that you couldn't do both. And it wasn't until like really a decade in that they were starting to make money. And it's crazy to think, like that's what you have to do, or at least be willing to do going in. It may not take that full 10 years, but that's, really some advice for whatever it's worth to anyone listening, that if you're not wanting to start a business and be in it for at least a minimum full time of a decade and really closer to 2 decades, don't even start, right?
Don't you think that also depends on the business? They're all different verticals, categories of business. You're talking a lot of technology with this.
I would say, but like really any business is a people business, right? And
to say if you're going to start a business, you need to be, it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's something I like to say. Meaning if you're going to launch a business and you want to see it do something significant, you need to be in it for the long haul,
right?
For the most part. And I think it would vary on the type of industry and type of business. If you're going to start a maid service company and you have experience in that, I don't know any maid service people that would do that kind of work for a decade and have no serious payoff. I would imagine that they wouldn't find that attractive. They want to. And when you also talk about investors, you can put your money in the market and you can get a payoff in 6 months or 12 months. So that's where a lot of people choose to put money there as an investor.
Yep.
It's a lot less risky. Payoff is great,
right?
And the time can be a lot shorter than going in and supporting a startup.
Yeah, we're actually seeing that a lot now in the venture capital space. A lot of the big, what are considered tier 1 venture capitalist firms that are Sequoia, Andreessen Horowitz, a few others that are kind of revered for funding a lot of the biggest, companies, specifically tech companies today. And they're starting to diversify, or in some cases, pretty much pull out from early stage investing. And they're becoming more like asset managers, more like traditional hedge funds that may do some early stage investing, but not, totally focusing their organization around early stage investing and, the way that they have over the last, decade or two, just because the returns aren't there. And I think a lot of that is because, whether it's been consciously or subconsciously, which I don't really like using those terms, but I think there's just been, hey, let's put our money into these companies that are going to generate a huge valuation. And then, hey, we get all of this money, on paper. But then actually Harvard is running into this problem where Harvard has like $50 billion endowment fund. And they make venture capital or have had made early stage venture capital investments. But all of like those dollars, overwhelming majority of those dollars are tied up as illiquid dollars that if they were to go try to sell them in secondary, private markets, they're going to get pennies on the dollar. So, they're Bill Ackman, I was telling you about this earlier. He was talking that Harvard's endowment is probably 40% of what it actually is stated to be if they were to try to cash out on their investments that a large part of the endowment is tied up in. And I think that's the case with a lot of VC firms that on paper they're doing great, but if they're ever to try to cash out of some of those investments that, this company, that we put in $500,000 to $1 million, a few $1 million to at the early stages, now worth $6 billion. A lot of them, are either on the verge of bankruptcy or, maybe a good business, but $100 million business and not a $6 billion business, and they just raised too much money.
If they were to sell that business, what's the true market value that they could get for that business if they were to sell it? And it may say it's worth $8 billion on paper,
right?
But an investor or somebody might want to purchase it for
$100 million,
a couple $100 million,
right?
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing, I think, not just within the venture capital market, but basically across, asset classes, right? It's just, people have been holding on to all these assets thinking that, they'll be able to gain money on them, like real estate. That's something that we're starting to see, I think, a turnaround in, where I think my parents' house is in the $650,000 range, or was maybe it's come down closer to $600,000 range. Our neighbor's house It was also above the $600,000 range without a basement, but just recently sold for $500,000, right? And so I think we're starting to see that more and more. And again, to continue to see that more and more over the next year or two, as you know, we've talked about previously, the market being uncertain, people being uncertain. Let's try to get as much cash as we can hold on to as possible, because very clearly these assets that we thought would be climbing in value, or at least holding their value, proving not to be the case, right?